May it please the court, Mr. Terry, Ms. Ismer, Ms. Zvante, co-counsel. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. If you might remember, my name is Brian Gonzalez, and along with my investigator, Billy Lane, who's sitting at the table, we represent Zvante Sampson. As you know, Mr. Sampson has been charged with premeditated first-degree murder, 2 counts of attempted premeditated first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, and shooting into a vehicle. He's charged with the other co-defendants that are seated at the table behind us, that being Quandarius Hammond, Jalen Bedward, Andrew Thompson, and James Denson. As Mr. Terry told you on August 22nd, 2021, it's alleged that multiple vehicles shot into a vehicle driven by Willie Brown, occupied by Mary Harrison in the front passenger seat and Suni Bell in the back seat. I think the evidence will indicate to you that Suni Bell was not restrained or in a car seat of any kind, and certainly was in the back seat at some portion of that back seat during the course of the vehicle's travel. As a result of the gunfire from one of the firearms in one of the vehicles, Suni Bell was killed. Zvante Sampson has continued or has contended from day one that he's not guilty of committing any of the offenses that he's charged with, that he did not, and you should know, he did not discharge a firearm. He's not alleged to have discharged a firearm. He's not alleged to have possessed a firearm. That he had nothing to do with causing the death of Suni Bell or the attempted murders of Mary Harrison and Willie Brown. The story here is in the details, ladies and gentlemen. Certainly there is going to be, I suspect, a great deal of evidence about where these people were, the defendants, where the victims were, where cars were, how they traveled. I anticipate that there will be a wholly insufficient lack of evidence that will be presented by the state to convince you that Zvante Sampson is criminally responsible for premeditated murder, premeditated attempted murder in the first degree, and conspiracy. Pay close attention to not what the state can show you, but what they can't show you in attempt to approve or to prove the elements of each and every one of the offenses that Mr. Sampson is charged with. I would ask you to determine what evidence the state provides you or who will testify that Zvante Sampson made an agreement with anyone to intend that a first-degree murder, an attempted first-degree murder took place or be committed, and how Zvante Sampson intended to assist someone or another person to actually commit that murder or attempted first-degree murder. This is a prosecution that lies in the hands of circumstantial evidence. I know Mr. Terry told you there is a number of evidence that will be submitted for your review that is direct. Yes, it's direct evidence that there's a video showing that there are people at the Chevron. Yes, it's direct evidence that they show a video with cars driving down the street. Yes, there is direct evidence in this case, but essentially, I don't believe you're going to hear an admission to a crime by Zvante Sampson. There's going to be no eyewitness that implicates him directly in any of the offenses for which he's charged. And remember that things that lead you to other things are very, very dangerous as you digest this evidence and as you deliberate to determine what Zvante Sampson did that constitutes a crime. In order to find somebody guilty, as we talked about, of any crime based on circumstantial evidence, you must preclude or eliminate any hypothesis of innocence. Do not take that leap without a foundation to do so. The central issue with respect to this case centers around, first, whether Zvante Sampson conspired with any defendant to commit these crimes. I expect that the court will instruct you that to prove a conspiracy, the state must prove that the intent of Zvante Sampson was that the offense of premeditated first-degree murder would be committed, and also that Zvante Sampson agreed, conspired, combined, or confederated with his co-defendants to cause this first-degree murder to be committed by them, by one of them, or by some of them. I counted just generally during the course of the state's opening statement that Mr. Terry used the word they 17 times. I anticipate that there's going to be a lot of statements that are centered around they did this or they did that during the balance of the next couple of weeks. You'll need to rely on the evidence to separate they from Zvante Sampson and what he did. Remember that every defendant, Quandarius Hammond, Andrew Thompson, Jalen Bedward, James Denson, they're all charged with the most serious offenses that we have. As you listen to the evidence this week, keep in mind that these defendants here sit in one trial, but they're in fact 5 individuals. Now, I understand you will have to determine whether they are principals and whether they conspired. But what one or some may be guilty of, others, in particular, Zvante Sampson, may not be guilty of. You determine if, as Mr. Terry says, there is overwhelming evidence against Zvante Sampson. What he told you in opening statement essentially is that he knows what Mr. Sampson was thinking. He knows what Mr. Sampson was saying. Mr. Terry thinks he knows what Mr. Sampson was doing. Make him prove those things to you by way of evidence. Because certainly what I say and what Mr. Terry says is not evidence. It's also going to be your job to determine whether Zvante Sampson was a principal to the crimes committed by one or more of the other defendants. I believe that the evidence will show that he's not a principal. I believe that the court will instruct you that in order for Zvante Sampson to be criminally responsible for the act of another, the state must prove that he intended the crime to occur and that he did some act or said something that was intended and that did incite, cause, encourage, assist, or advise another person to actually commit the crime. Okay? That's what makes him a principal, because he didn't carry a gun and he didn't discharge a gun. If the state meets that burden, then the defendant must be treated as anyone else that had done all of the things that were alleged. In this case, the state must prove that Zvante Sampson intended that this killing occurred, although he doesn't have to be present when it happens. I believe that during the course of the week, you're going to hear from a number of police officers and detectives from the Tampa Police Department, some that secured the scene, some that conducted interviews, some that sought evidence at various places, video from various places. A key member of that team is Detective Chris Saleha. the lead detective in this case. I anticipate that you'll hear also from crime scene technicians that took photographs and collected casings and other items of evidence from the scene, from the search warrants, from the vehicles. Please pay close attention to what evidence and where it was located, including distances, as Mr. Terry had suggested to you, from locations of vehicles involved in this shooting. There are 3 vehicles identified. I also expect, as Mr. Terry has indicated to you, that you'll see a number of videos beginning with the congregation at the Chevron gas station, which you've already seen a portion of, and others along the route that was taken by various vehicles that are involved in this case. I expect the quality of some of those videos to be marginal. I expect the quality of others to be very, very good. Each of them tells a piece of the story. And certainly it is, in and of itself, direct evidence. But you have to look closely, and I implore you to take each one of these videos exactly for what they are worth. Focus on these videos, ladies and gentlemen, very intensely on what they don't show you. Mr. Terry's talked about what they do show you. But what is just as important, if not more important, surely as it relates to Zvante Sampson, is what they don't show you. As Mr. Terry mentioned, we believe that you're going to hear testimony from Detective Saleha that on September 30th, 2022, Mr. Sampson was arrested and provided a statement where he was untruthful about the entirety of his knowledge and what occurred on August 21st, 2022, and the part that he played. It'll be your job as you listen or as he testifies to this statement by Mr. Sampson to consider the reasons why Mr. Sampson would say the things he said and what he would tell Detective Saleha immediately after he was being arrested for premeditated first-degree murder and attempted premeditated first-degree murder, as well as conspiracy to join the others in the commission of a first-degree murder. Remember, as the weeks go on, and I say that not meaning weeks and weeks and weeks, but during the course of the testimony that will be elicited during this trial, that you are the judges of the credibility of the witnesses in this case. I believe that critical evidence will come from the testimony of 2 of the victims, Mary Harrison and Willie Brown. She's also known as Bree. You might hear her referred to as Bree. It's up to you, ladies and gentlemen, to determine why Willie Brown and Mary Harrison were in the area of the East Hillsborough Avenue neighborhood at approximately 9 p.m. on August 22nd of 2021, and what part they played. You have to determine what Willie Brown's motivation for being there was. You have to determine, and I believe the evidence will indicate to you that something is amiss, ladies and gentlemen, with someone being less than candid about why, where, and when, and what was the purpose of their presence there. Please listen carefully to their testimony and any inconsistencies that arise, because inconsistencies are evidence too. It causes you to determine the credibility of what someone is saying, because the story is in the details in this case. It's not solely rooted in the videos that you will see. I'd only suggest and ask you to please keep an open mind during the course of this trial, that you listen and you weigh the evidence as it comes from the witness stand in the form of testimony from the witnesses. You judge their credibility, all of them. And any consistencies that I believe will become apparent during the course of that testimony, along with the admitted evidence by way of documents, by way of pictures, by way of videos. You owe this to yourselves. You certainly owe it to Suni Bell's family. And as importantly, you owe it to Zvante Sampson. I'd like to briefly talk to you about a couple of things that we went over previously. First, the presumption of innocence. Remember that Zvante Sampson is cloaked with that presumption of innocence throughout the course of these proceedings until that presumption has been overcome by evidence. He's not compelled to become a witness in this case. He need not prove anything to you. You promised me that you would not hold that against them and wonder why. On the other hand, if he were to choose to make himself a witness in this case, you also told me that you would give him the same credence that you would give any other witness that takes the stand. Secondly, we talked about the burden of proof. Remember that Mr. Sampson is charged in one indictment, one charging document that in and of itself is not evidence, with multiple crimes. And each one of those crimes has elements that must be proven by the state of Florida before you can find someone guilty of that particular crime. 2 out of 3 is not sufficient. 1 out of 2 is not sufficient. It has to be a clean sweep, ladies and gentlemen. And as part of that clean sweep, you understand that reasonable doubt is the gravamen of our judicial system. That if we were to bring you 2 conceivable theories in this particular case, one that would suggest that Mr. Sampson's guilty, another one that suggests that Mr. Sampson is innocent, that's the nature of reasonable doubt. That's not a speculative doubt. That's not a forced doubt. I know that after hearing the evidence in this case and giving us the same undivided attention that you have given us thus far, that you'll find that Mr. Sampson did not conspire with any defendant in this case to commit a first-degree murder, premeditated, attempted murders in the first degree, premeditated, or did he shoot into an occupied vehicle. I believe the evidence is going to be crystal clear that Zvante Sampson was not a principal in this case, that there will be no evidence to indicate that he was a principal in this case. He did not intend for a murder or an attempted murder to occur. He did not do any act intentionally or say something that caused someone other than himself to commit a murder or an attempted murder. Listen to the evidence very carefully, weigh it, and again, be very wary of what the state of Florida cannot show you. Thank you.
Mr. Hernandez?
Yes,
sir.
Council. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. If I could reintroduce myself, my name is Danny Hernandez, and I represent Mr. Jalen Bedward, who's seated next to me. I want to begin by thanking you very much for your service. I know it's an intrusion into your personal and business activities, but you're an essential part of our judicial system. We can't have jury trials like we have in this country, which is unique in this country, without people like yourselves that are able and willing to provide your attention and your service. I also want to begin by reminding you, I think Mr. Gonzalez already mentioned it, everything that Mr. Terry said on behalf of the state of Florida in their opening statement is not evidence. And for that matter, none of what the attorneys are saying, the defense attorneys are saying, it's not evidence. But remember that the entire burden of proof is on the state of Florida. And what you are to consider is only the evidence that's presented during the course of the trial, not what Mr. Terry is suggesting in his opening statements. The purpose, though, of the opening statements is to give you an idea of what we believe that the evidence will show or not show. I believe the evidence in this case will show that my client, Jalen Bedward, is not guilty. And there's no question that you're going to hear a lot of testimony, and some of it is crime scene technicians talking about different things that they saw at the scene of the shooting, a collection of evidence, things of that nature. But the overriding thing that I know is part of this case is that there's a horrible tragedy that occurred in the death of Suni Bell, a 4-year-old child. And as we talked about in jury selection, you are being asked to set aside, as your responsibility as jurors is to set aside any feelings of that in determining whether or not the state has proven their case beyond a reasonable doubt as to each separate defendants. I believe the evidence is going to show the following, that Mr. Bedward was merely present at the scene of this shooting. He was with his friends, the co-defendants. He was at the scene when the shooting took place, but did not participate in any way. I believe the evidence is going to show that Mr. Bedward did not conspire to commit any crime. He is not a principal to first-degree murder. The evidence is going to show, I believe, that Mr. Bedward had no knowledge of anything illegal or violent that was going to occur. And I believe the evidence will show that there is no evidence of any willful ignorance on behalf of Mr. Bedward. Now, the evidence is going to show, and Mr. Terry already mentioned it, is that my client, Mr. Bedward, did in fact own and possess and had a firearm in his car. He is a legal owner of that weapon. And the evidence is going to show that he never fired that firearm. He cooperated fully with the police. He identified himself as the owner and driver of the Chrysler 300. He admitted he was present at the scene driving his car. He provided cell phone information and actually handed over his cell phone to the police. He consented to the search of his apartment, having nothing to hide. He denied any involvement in the shooting and does not know who shot or how it happened. I believe the evidence is going to show that the surveillance video is consistent with Mr. Bedward being merely present at the scene. Apparently, and you'll hear of the evidence, there was a muzzle flash coming somewhere from the passenger side. I believe the evidence is going to show that Mr. Bedward was unaware, he saw trouble, and as the driver of that vehicle, his only focus was getting the heck out of there. I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that if you consider what we talked about during jury selection, that reasonable doubt can come from the evidence. It can also come from conflict in evidence, and it can also come from lack of evidence. And I believe that considering those two things, those three things, evidence, lack of evidence, and conflict in evidence, that the only just verdict in this case on behalf of Mr. Bedward as to all counts is a verdict of not guilty. Now, before I conclude, I do have two major requests of you. I already referred to the tragic death of Suni Bell. Please, I ask you, do not let sympathy drive any of your evaluation of the state's case. No question, this was a horrific tragedy, but there can never be a conclusion of, well, because of that, someone has to pay. There is no attempt to downplay what happened to this poor child, but that does not mean that the state has sufficient evidence, proof beyond a reasonable doubt, that my client is guilty of what he's accused of. And I believe the evidence will show that they do not have that evidence. And my second request is please do not speculate. The defendant, Mr. Bedward, never fired his firearm. There is going to be no proof that showing knowledge of any illegal activity or criminal intent by Mr. Bedward. You must not conclude that Mr. Bedward had knowledge or criminal intent through association with others or being merely present at the scene of a shooting. And on the same line as echoing what Mr. Gonzalez said, there can't be conclusions based on they. References to they is not evidence that Mr. Bedward, specifically Mr. Bedward, had involvement, criminal involvement in this shooting. And if I believe that if you grant my request, that the only just and correct verdict is a verdict of not guilty as to Mr. Bedward. Thank you.
Mr. Fischetti.
Good morning, Your Honor. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
And please, court counsel. Ladies and gentlemen, the first thing that the state is asking you to find my client, James Denson, seated in the black jacket in the corner over there, is the murder of Suni Bell. And I think it's helpful to take a look at the elements of the offense in order to kind of give us a guide for what we're going to be looking at during the course of our time together. The first thing that they have to show is that her death was caused by the criminal act of James Denson. So it's the very first thing that they're going to have to show in order to show that he's guilty of a first-degree premeditated murder. Second thing that they're going to have to show based on that premeditation is that you're going to have to find beyond a reasonable doubt that based on the circumstances of the killing and the conduct of James Denson, that death resulted of Suni Bell. Okay, so I think it's important here, as some of the other attorneys have touched on, to note that separate crimes have been charged against each of the defendants here. The grouping of this trial is done for efficiency, it's done for convenience, but that doesn't mean that any of the constitutional rights that my client James Denson has should be waived based on that convenience, based on that efficiency, based on that economy. And you have to decide whether or not my client is guilty or not guilty based only on his conduct. And the conduct of other persons involved in this case should not affect your verdict as to James Denson. The second charge of conspiracy that the state has talked about in saying that these people were working together, okay? The state, as it presents its evidence today, must prove an intent to kill on behalf of James Denson as part of that conspiracy. An intent to kill on behalf of my client. So they can't transfer the intent of somebody else on him if he did not intend that act to occur. That's where the conspiracy portion of this is. So let's talk about this when we're talking about the circumstances of the killing, when we're talking about the conduct of the accused. So those are the two phrases that I'm going to ask you to keep in mind during the presentation of the state's evidence. The circumstances of the killing and the conduct of the accused, in this situation being James Denson. So let's talk about the circumstances of the killing. You've seen some of the previews of the video. You're going to see a lot more evidence. But let's talk about which car. Okay, they're going to allege that he was in the third vehicle, not the first one, not the second, not the third. Let's talk about the timing of those vehicles as they interact with Willie Brown, as they interact with the vehicle containing Mary Harrison and Suni Bell. Let's talk about a rifle versus a handgun. The state's going to allege that there is a handgun that was in the possession of James Denson. Let's talk about which handgun, because there are going to be multiple handguns that are discussed. But essentially, if the state brings in evidence as they have promised, they're going to say that there are two shots that are made by James Denson. So I'm going to ask you to look at the timeline of those shots and where they are. And I will submit to you that the shell casings, two of them, just two shots from James Denson's 9mm Taurus that he purchased himself, that he had a concealed weapons permit for. Those two shots, those two shell casings, are going to be located to the east of where the vehicle containing Suni Bell and Mary Harrison, and originally driven by Willie Brown, was located, crashed against the telephone pole. So those shots, those two shell casings, are going to be almost the last in the timeline as we go ahead and go through the timing of this. Okay, so it's going to be after the shots from the first car. It's going to be, for the most part, after the discharges from the assault rifle. It's important when you look at where those casings were discovered, as it talks about the timing of the events and the people who are interacting with. Because as we're going east on Hillsborough, okay, the first street that we're going to be at is 45th. Okay, 45th is going to be important because that's the street that Willie Brown has already been shot at. He has already exited his vehicle, which is still in motion, and he actually takes off north on 45th into the neighborhood over there. And I believe you're going to see from the surveillance video, and you're going to see from Mr. Brown, that there's actually shots being fired at him in this area. So it would be reasonable to infer from that evidence that the persons who are shooting at Willie Brown, okay, either had to fire on his vehicle before it got to 45th, or be firing at his person as he's running down 45th, and that evidence of that shooting would be located in that area. As it after 43rd, to the east of 43rd, that's where the Infiniti occupied by Mary Harrison and Suni Bell was finally located. And it's important to say that there will not be one person that will be able to come into court during this trial and say which handgun or rifle, which firearm actually struck Suni Bell. Okay, which projectile from which handgun. Nobody's going to be able to say that. Nobody's going to be able to say that this gun is responsible for her killing. And as far as some of the other evidence involved, you're not going to have anybody that's going to be able to say that the firearm carried by James Denson was responsible for any of the holes, any of the strikes, any of the damage to the car, or anything as it relates to that Infiniti. Nobody can tell you the caliber of the bullets, the style of the firearm, or the person that's responsible for many of these shots. So I want you to take a look at that, and then I want you to take a look at the conduct of the accused. So we have the circumstances of the killing and the conduct of the accused. The state is asking you to infer that, again, these people are working together. They masked up. I can hear anybody say that James Denson took any steps to conceal himself in any way on this night. that they armed themselves. No, he didn't go running and find something somewhere else. Again, he's lawfully carrying a firearm permitted by law by the state of Florida. So he didn't mask up. He didn't arm himself. And all of these things go to, again, whether or not there was an understanding, whether or not there was an agreement, or whether this is a reaction. Let's take a look at the actions after the event. So this happened August 22nd, 2021. And Mr. Denson, when interviewed by the police, volunteered that he had taken his Taurus 9mm handgun and that he had pawned it at East Tampa Pawn and Gun nearly 30 days after the shooting. And I think you'll see that this is not something that was, this was something that garnered a lot of attention in the city of Tampa. Okay. And if we're looking at the conduct of James Denson following the event, whether there's a consciousness of guilt, whether or not he was trying to cover up, whether or not he was trying to hide, the first thing you're not going to do if you have a gun that has a body on it is tell the police exactly where you took it. The first thing that you're going to do is throw it in the river, throw it in the ocean, do anything you can to disassociate yourself from that firearm. But James Denson didn't do that. Okay. He didn't change possession of it the next day, the day after that, or until about 30 days later when he took it to East Tampa Gun and Pawn. And if anybody hasn't pawned anything before, what you do is you give them your identification and you give them your fingerprint so that it can be easily tracked back to you. So this is not done under the shadow of somebody trying to hide. This is somebody who is living his life out in the open with nothing to hide. And if you're trying to hide your involvement in some type of a criminal activity, the last thing you're going to do, if you are going to pawn it, is go to East Tampa Gun and Pawn, which is literally adjacent to the Jet on Hillsborough, where this whole situation started. You're going to go as far away as you can. So if we're looking at the circumstances of the killing, and if we're looking at the conduct of James Denson, I would submit to you that the state's burden will not be met. And how are we going to look at that? Well, if we're looking at the evidence, a verdict of not guilty can come from the evidence itself. It can come from a conflict in the evidence, or it can come from a lack of evidence. So if we're looking at the manner in which Suni Bell died, the time and the location of the acts in relation to the shooting of Suni Bell, the shooting at Mary Harrison and at Willie Brown, it would be impossible for the state to meet its burden as to James Denson. So I ask you to keep in mind the circumstances of the killing and the conduct of James Denson, not anybody else. Thank you very much.
Mr. Sonari? Yes, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, state co-counsel. Again, my name is Nick Sonardi. I have the pleasure of representing Andrew Thompson, and because of the configuration of the courtroom, we are seated way back there. That's Mr. Thompson, the gentleman to his right, and the team, just Scotty Sonardi, my associate. A lady sitting there is our investigator, Katie Rain. This is a very tragic circumstance. No one is denying that. The death of a 4-year-old child, Suni Bell, is very, very tragic. It's also very sympathetic. But the court will instruct you that sympathy is not an issue in this case. It's a matter of the facts, whether or not the state can prove their allegations that are outlined in the indictment alleging the first-degree murder and attempted first-degree murders and a conspiracy, etc. I agree with other co-counsel. This is totally a circumstantial case, okay? I anticipate the state is going to provide a lot of crime scene texts. You're going to hear a lot of videos. You're going to see a lot of videos. You may hear some in some of the videos. There's going to be a lot of crime scene text. What we don't have is any direct evidence that incriminates Andrew Thompson. Okay. He admits to being at the service station there on Hillsborough Avenue, the Chevron. I think they call it the Jet. But he's there with a number of other people, not only the individuals that are sitting here today, the defendants that are sitting here today, but with 8 or 10 other individuals who are at that gas station. The state wants you to believe, and I believe their argument is going to be, by the actions of those individuals, somehow or other, they conspired to do this shooting. Okay. There is no other evidence of that other than the video of their activity at that service station. The state wants you to believe, at the conclusion of all the evidence, that that is sufficient to constitute a conspiracy between these defendants and possibly others for the shooting and death of Suni Bell. Andrew Thompson admits to being present at the gas station with a number of, as indicated, a number of other individuals besides the 5 individuals that are sitting here. It's probably 8 or 10 individuals there, maybe more. You'd have to count them on the videos. You're going to see, as I've indicated, numerous surveillance videos from different locations. There's probably 6 or 8, maybe more. Okay. What they show is very obscure photos of vehicles moving and what is purported to be, and probably is, gunshots coming from different vehicles. The state alleges basically that there is a Infiniti that's occupied by Willie Brown, Mary Harrison, and Suni Bell that is shot. That's the vehicle, the victim's vehicle, going down Hillsborough Avenue that ultimately crashes into a pole. Mr. Brown exit, Mary Harrison exits, and that's the vehicle that Suni Bell is in. There's also 3 other vehicles. I believe Detective Salela will testify that besides the vehicles that allegedly are occupied by these defendants, there was also another vehicle. So instead of being 3 vehicles, 2 vehicles occupied by these alleged defendants, and a 3rd vehicle occupied by 4 other individuals that are not charged. But there was a 3rd vehicle that's not charged. That's, I believe, Detective Salela will testify about. I think we will find there were numerous, and the state will present evidence, I anticipate, showing the number of gunshots where shell casings were located, the type of shell casings, and that they were analyzed. By that, I mean they were analyzed for evidentiary value. Was there any DNA, fingerprints, etc.? And I think we're going to find out there is no evidence that connects those shell casings to Andrew Thompson. The state talked about an opening. I anticipate we will see evidence of cell phone data. By that, I mean location data, where certain phones were located at the time. And I believe the state indicated, and I think the evidence will show, that the cell phone of Andrew Thompson was not specifically at the location where the shootings occurred. It was at a different location away from where the shots were fired, and does not place them specifically at the location. This will start out to be and will conclude as a circumstantial case. The state is going to do a lot of fluff in terms of the videos, in terms of crime scene text, in terms of all the analysis, the phone analysis, etc. There is no direct evidence that incriminates Andrew Thompson. There's no identification by anyone of any of these defendants other than them being present at the Chevron gas station. That's the only evidence. I submit to you that at the close of all the evidence, that the state's conclusion that Andrew Thompson was a principal or a participant in the shooting is woefully lacking. This is clearly a circumstantial case, and I submit to you at the close of all of the evidence that there will be a lack of evidence and a conflict in the evidence. And I implore you not to duplicate the tragedy of the death of Suni Bell and wrongfully convict another person, a person, for the death of Suni Bell. I would only double the tragedy. I submit to you that the proper verdict at the close of all the evidence presented by the state is a verdict of not guilty as to Andrew Thompson. Thank you.
Ms. Bradley.
I'm going to be brief. So there's been a lot of opening arguments, and as everyone has said, what we say to you is not evidence. So I'm going to reserve my argument about what the evidence shows related to Mr. Hammond for my closing, because you all are going to determine what the true facts are. You will get the law at the end of this, but one of the things, and some people have touched on it, but I want you to see the actual jury instruction, because what makes this case pretty unusual is the fact that we're all being tried together, which is not our choice. So I just want you all to see what the law is related to that and what the judge is going to instruct you at the end of the case. And it says a separate crime is charged against each defendant in each count of the indictment. The defendants have been tried together. However, the charges against each defendant and the evidence applicable to him must be considered separately. A finding of guilty or not guilty as to one or some of the defendants must not affect your verdict as to any other defendants or other crimes charged. So you take the evidence separate for each count that individuals are charged with in each defendant. So just so you all have that guideline to guide you when you're evaluating the evidence. We are going to ask that you use a critical ear and listen to the testimony. Pay attention to what was said earlier, what is said today, what may change, and what matches up and doesn't match up. And at the end of the case, I will be asking you to find Mr. Hammond not guilty. Thank you.